Okay, we've had a long break. I think my travels are going to be quite a disruption, but thank you for being with me. And we're going to do Leviticus 13 now, defiling blemishes. We had stopped at Leviticus 12, I think, and we talked about the defiling from childbirth. And we explained that it was really, one way to look at it is really that it wasn't because giving birth is a sin or it's dirty or anything like that, because childbirth was commanded by God in Genesis when he says, go forth and multiply. So anything commanded by God, when we do it, we cannot be sinning. And so we learned the concept that cleanness in the Old Testament is not about the cleanness we think about, no, when we think about dirty as opposed to clean. And the concept of Israel clean was being clean ritually so that one could enter into the presence of God. And fortunately for us now, because of Jesus Christ, as Christians, we can enter into the presence of God anytime through the blood of Jesus Christ, through his sinless nature. And because we remain sinners ourselves, we have to daily cleanse ourselves of our sins that we know of, and even of the sins that we may unwittingly uh, do without knowing about it till later. So in the Old Testament, we've learned through Leviticus that God accepts us in his grace for even things that we may not have consciously sinned about till we know about it later. So Leviticus 13, I will be talking about the meaning of the passage, and then I will talk about application. So this lesson today is about blemishes, and you will read a lot about blemishes. Okay, so rather long chapter, so let me begin. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons, the priests. So we have a word here, leprous disease. In some of the older translations, leprosy, like the King James Bible. I'll be explaining to you what exactly is this disease later on. And the original Hebrew, of course, is a word that may or may not include what today we'll know as leprosy. Okay, it's actually a word that refers to several different skin diseases, which may or may not include leprosy. Okay, verse 3, and the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body, and if the hair in the diseased area has turned white, and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a case of leprous disease. When the priest has examined him, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if the spot is white in the skin of his body and appears no deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest shall shut up the diseased person for 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and if in his eyes the disease is checked and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall shut him up for another 7 days. And the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day, and if the diseased area has faded and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only an eruption. And he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the eruption spreads in the skin after he has shown himself to the priest for his cleansing, he shall appear again before the priest, and the priest shall look, and if the eruption has spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. it is a leprous disease. So you can see that this is a procedure for the priest to examine people who have diseases on the skin. And it is an elaborate and careful process. The priest is given information on what symptoms to look for, and if certain symptoms appear, then it's unclean. Certain symptoms, then it's clean. And there is a quarantine period. The Lord's word says to the priest, "You shall quarantine. Yeah, you shall shut up the diseased person for 7 days, and then another 7 days if you are not sure." So it's a careful process of observation. And today, reading this as modern people, we see this as perhaps a way of quarantining people who are infected and whose infection might spread to other people. So we get this medical sort of protocol. We see it as a medical protocol. Continuing in verse 9, when a man is afflicted with a leprous disease, he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall look. And if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and there is raw flesh in the dwelling, it is a chronic leprous disease in the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. You shall not shut him up, for he is unclean. And if the leprous disease breaks out in the skin, so that the leprous disease covers all the skin of the diseased person from head to foot, so far as the priest can see, then the priest shall look, and if the leprous disease has covered all his body, he shall pronounce him clean of the disease. It has all turned white, and he is clean. But when raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. And the priest shall examine the raw flesh and pronounce him unclean. Raw flesh is unclean, for it is a leprous disease. But if the raw flesh recovers and turns white again, then he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. And if the disease has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce the diseased person clean. He is clean. So this second passage from 9 to 17 talks about chronic leprous disease. So this person has got a disease that keeps coming back. So the disease is serious one, and there's no quarantine straight away. This person is unclean, the priest, verse 11 says. All right. And well, because there is exposed flesh, is bleeding perhaps, and so on. So it does seem strange, however, that when the disease covers all of the person from head to foot, the person is clean. We would think this should mean he's totally unclean. This is a bit strange, but I think part of it is because of the translation difficulties of this passage. Some of the words used are rather obscure because it's not in the modern Hebrew anymore. So we have to guess what it means. So basically, the idea is still that the priest would be examining the person and then declaring if the disease is clear or not. And this appears to be the job of a doctor, and perhaps they didn't have doctors. In many cultures, you find that the priest is also the doctor, right? So this seems to be the case for us. But as I will point out later, this is not really medical, because the priest isn't told to prescribe any medicine or do any treatment. It's just basically quarantine and then re-examine. And when the person gets well, to come back and the priest checks whether the person is truly well. So it's really at the best, the priest is not functioning as a doctor, but functioning as a diagnostician, who then is really, whose job is really then being a public officer to keep the disease from spreading in the community. Now, that's the first section of Leviticus 13, talking about a leprous disease, a chronic leprous disease. The second section deals with what is translated boil Some translations use other words. Basically, as I said, because the Hebrew medical word or Hebrew word for this medical condition is not something we understand anymore. Okay, so from the context, the translators guess that perhaps what he refers to is something that we would call a boil today, a blister, a kind of a bubble on the skin. Verse 18, if there is in the skin of one's body a boil and it heals, and in the place of the boil there comes a white swelling or a reddish white spot, then it shall be shown to the priest. And the priest shall look, and if it appears deeper than the skin, and his hair has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a case of leprous disease that has broken out in the boil. So you can see that the priest seems to be looking for very observable things like swellings and redness and things that go beyond deeper than the skin, and the hair changes colors. This would all be signs of a serious disease. Verse 21, but if the priest examines it and there is no white hair in it, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall shut him up 7 days. So now it appears that there is a healing, but the priest, just to be sure, quarantines this person for another 7 days. And verse 22, and if it spreads in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a disease. But if the spot remains in one place and does not spread, it is the scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or when the body has a burn on its skin and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a spot, reddish white or white, the priest shall examine it, and if the hair in the spot has turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin, that it is a leprous disease. It has broken out in the burn, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a case of leprous disease. So now here is another section, another case of burns. And of course, burns can get infected. So this appears to be a burn that has become infected. And it's certainly not leprosy. Leprosy doesn't occur this way. So it is the same word used for different skin disease. Verse 26. But if the priest examines it and there is no white hair in the spot, and it is no deeper than the skin, but has faded, the priest shall shut him up 7 days, and the priest shall examine him the 7th day. If it is spreading in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a case of leprous disease. But if the spot remains in one place and does not spread in the skin, but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn, and the priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is the scar of the burn. When a man or woman has a disease on the head or the beard, so now there's a new disease, the priest shall examine the disease, and if it appears deeper than the skin and the hair in it is yellow and thin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an itch, a leprous disease of the head or the beard. And if the priest examines the itching disease and it appears no deeper than the skin and there is no black in it, then the priest shall shut up the person with the itching disease for 7 days. And on the 7th day, the priest shall examine the disease. If the itch has not spread and there is in it no yellow hair, and the itch appears to be no deeper than the skin, then he shall shave himself. But the itch he shall not shave, and the priest shall shut up the person with the itching disease for another 7 days. So here again, the word itch translates a word that we're not quite sure, and so different translators translate differently. Some translate it as a rash, and it appears that maybe there is some kind of discomfort. But if it's true leprosy, leprosy is a disease of the nerves. So this doesn't describe that kind of leprosy, because a person who has that kind of leprosy has no more feeling, no more pain. Verse 34, and on the 7th day, the priest shall examine the itch, and if the itch has not spread in the skin, and it appears to be no deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the itch spreads in the skin after his cleansing, Then the priest shall examine him, and if it shall spread in the skin, the priest need not seek for the yellow hair, he is unclean. But if in his eyes the itch is unchanged and black hair has grown in it, the itch is healed and he is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. When a man or woman has spots on the skin of the body, white spots, this priest shall look, and if the spots on the skin of the body are of a dull white, it is leukoderma that is broken out in the skin, he is clean. And here again is another term which translators have no idea, but looking at the context, we do know in modern medical science of disease where the skin breaks out into white spots, and verse 40 says, verse 39 says, this is clean. So this is not really a disease that spreads. It doesn't it doesn't infect other people. And we find that dark-skinned people would have this kind of disease very obviously because they're dark, and then the white patches, the skin becomes very patchy white. This is again not leprosy, so the ESV translates this word as leukoderma, which is one of the diseases present today. And Michael Jackson, he was a black man, but he was all white because he had leukoderma. And the Jews, we know, have black hair. So verse 37, black hair, right? So that's normal for a Jew. Yellow hair, verse 36 is not normal. Some disease has changed the color of the hair. Okay, so verse 40. If a man's hair falls off from his head, he's bald, he's clean. Yeah, that's good news for people like me. Our hair fall off. It's not a disease. It's a normal process for a man. Verse 41, and if a man's hair falls out from his forehead, he has baldness of the forehead, he is clean. But if there is on the bald head or the bald forehead a reddish white diseased area, it is a leprous disease breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. The Hebrew talks about, the front and the back, forehead and back head. Then the priest shall examine him, and if the disease swelling is reddish white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, like the appearance of leprous disease in the skin of the body, he is a leprous man, he is unclean. The priest must pronounce him unclean. This disease is on his head. So as in the protocol, the priest observes, and if he needs to, he puts the person through a quarantine and then checks again, and then he makes a decision, this is clean or this is unclean, right? And this is the consequence of a person who is declared unclean. Verses 45, 46 describes how it will be done. The quarantine has not helped. Now the person goes into a permanent quarantine. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall uncover his upper lip, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So this person cannot touch others. And when he moves around, he has to shout so people stay away from him as far as they can. And he will be unclean as long as the disease is with him. And if there's no medical cure, actually, this could be even a lifetime sentence. He shall live alone. ESV says, some translations say the same, NIV, but the Hebrew actually doesn't have the word alone. And it appears that these people do live in colonies outside the camp or the city, a colony of lepers. When Jesus walked out of the city in one incident, he met 10 lepers, right? And he healed all 10 and only one came back to him. So we find that they may live, not necessarily alone, but they live outside the camp, outside the city. They are isolated. And sometimes it appears that family members would go out and stay with them, take care of them, feed them, and so on. And so these family members will be themselves unclean, but because they don't have the disease, especially disease like Hansen's disease, which is what we call leprosy today. The disease um, is a long-term one, and so the people, the family members may want to help, and then they come in and they go through ordinary cleansing. They don't get easily infected that way. Okay, and then now finally in the last section of Leviticus 13, there is a totally different situation. So I have different colors to indicate to you the different sections. So now there's a different section about garments and leather products. Verse 47. When there is a case of leprous disease in the garment, now we know that diseases don't affect, I mean, clothes and inanimate things, they are not alive. They don't get disease. But to the Hebrew mind, it's something has happened, mold or fungal attack. And so there is mildew and so on. So some translations would refer to mildew in this section, but the word is the same as the word for the earlier skin diseases, and I'll explain that in a short time. Okay, after I finish reading this. So verse 47, when there is a case of leprous disease in a garment, whether a woolen or linen garment, in warp or woof of linen or wool, or in a skin or in anything made of skin. Okay, verse 48, in warp or woof, these are technical words for different kinds of, for the weaving process. The warp is the vertical thread, and the woof is the horizontal thread. Okay, so in the warp or woof, and the Hebrew has a way of, we call it merism, of referring to the totality of something. This is a totality of the cloth or the garment, and it talks about the sections, the warp and the woof, to refer to the totality of the garment. Just as when it says, when the Hebrew scripture says day and night, it means the whole 24 hours, totality of the day and night. The east and the west refers to everywhere, right? From the east to the west. Okay, that's a Hebrew way of talking about a totality of anything. Verse 49, if the disease is greenish or reddish in the garment, and the Hebrew here talks about a very bright green, a very bright red. Yeah, if the disease is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the skin, or in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin, it is a case of leprous disease, and it shall be shown to the priest. And the priest shall examine the disease and shut up that which has the disease for 7 days. Then he shall examine the disease on the 7th day. If the disease is spread in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or in the skin, whatever be the use of the skin, the disease is a persistent leprous disease, it is unclean. And he shall burn the garment. You see, the garment will not heal, right? It's not flesh, it's not a biological thing. So the way to stop this infection or this infestation is to burn the garment or the thing that has been affected by the mold or the mildew. And he shall burn the garment or the warp or the woof, the wool or the linen or any article made of skin that is diseased, for it is a persistent leprous disease. It shall be burned in the fire. And if the priest examines, and if the disease has not spread in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing in which it is the disease, and he shall shut it up for another 7 days. And the priest shall examine the diseased thing after it has been washed, and if the appearance of the diseased area has not changed, though the disease has not spread, it is unclean. You shall burn it in the fire, whether the rod is on the back or on the front. So just as a bald head, you examine the front and the back, the garment, you examine the front and the back. But if the priest examines, and if the diseased area has faded after it has been washed, he shall tear it out of the garment, or the skin, or the warp, or the woof. Then if it appears again in the garment, in the warp, or the woof, or in any article made of skin, it is spreading. You should burn with fire whatever has the disease. But the garment or the warp or the wool or any article made of skin from which the disease departs when you have washed it shall then be washed a second time and be clean. And in summary, verse 59, this is the law for a case of leprous disease in a garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or the wool, or in any article made of skin, to determine whether it is clean or unclean. So, the meaning of the passage. This chapter, chapter 13 of Leviticus, and the next, chapter 14, deal with ritually defiling blemishes. The word used is the Hebrew chara'at, same word for both the skin and the articles. And many older translations use the misleading word leprosy to translate chara'at. The origin of this is actually the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The rabbi sat down in the first century before Christ, and they basically thought, hey, a lot of Jews don't read Hebrew anymore, and many of them are Greek speaking because of the conquests of Alexander the Great. The whole world now has an international language, Greek, and so this was the Greek translation we call the Septuagint. And the Septuagint translated this word lepra. It appears that in those days and during the Roman Empire in the first century after Christ, and after, lepra referred to what we would today will include what we today call leprosy. So lepra was then the reason why the King James translators used the word leprosy to translate this word charat. But they knew that houses and clothes don't have leprosy, and they use and modern translations use the word mildew instead. But the King James also used the word leprosy. Okay, the word is ancient and its meaning is obscure, but it appears to describe a lot of different skin diseases. Scholars have identified some Bible scholars have got medical training, and they identified from the symptoms psoriasis, eczema, fevers, different kinds of and leukoderma, different diseases. So it appears to describe a lot of different skin diseases, which may include Hansen's disease, and it includes reference to mildew and others. So many modern scholars, in fact, doubt that it even refers to Hansen's disease, because some scholars point out that it was hardly known before the medieval ages. This disease that we call today Hansen's disease. It is probably not even present when Moses wrote this passage. So they think that it cannot refer to Hansen's disease. But because the medical words in this chapter are obscure and our knowledge is incomplete, the scholars who want to play safe would say it's all included, yeah. And we do not know if really there was any Hansen's disease, but some of the early symptoms of Hansen's disease are what is described here too. So anyway, swellings, boils, rash, scab, sore, different translations use different words for the same things that we have just read. So the important thing to note is that the focus of this chapter is not medical. It is ritual. It is the priest looking at a person to see whether they are holy enough, right? Clean enough, pure enough to go into the worship of God, to go into the temple or the tabernacle. There is therefore no need to identify the actual specific diseases in this passage to understand it. And the priest is not called to be a physician here, as the chapter doesn't lay down any treatments, no cures. He just lets them sit in the quarantine room till he comes back again in 7 days. The priest is acting more like a diagnostician for ritual purposes to see whether this person is fit to worship God. And only incidentally as a public health official, because, in so quarantining real diseases, the priest would also uh, achieve the isolation of a contagious disease and quarantines that we understand very full well now, particularly as we are still going through the pandemic that is called COVID-19. So while our modern minds, strive to understand this as a medical situation, and the priest is trying to prevent the spread of disease. And yeah, you can see that perhaps incidentally God is doing that, teaching the priest to prevent the contamination, whether it is a disease or mold spreading and making people unhealthy. God does care for our health after all. But the main purpose is really a lesson on purity and impurity, you might say, an object lesson. The instructions are intended to isolate ritually impure blemishes. That's why I use the word blemishes, because it's not all about diseases. And they all look the same. That's a problem. That's why the same Hebrew word, with the same word covering skin diseases and fungal infections, mildews, molds in fabrics, leather products, and houses. With a common characteristic, they cause flicking. The flicks come off. They look repulsive. They can spread, and there may be discoloration, different colors, green and red and white, and so on. So the impure item is isolated and taken into a different room, and it cannot be put into the camp, because inside the camp God resides, and if God resides there, it is pure and holy. Every impurity must be removed. Now, of course, later rabbis and even early Christian scholars would look at this as banishment, because they've seen how God strikes, for example, Miriam and Hezekiah and some of the other sinful kings of Israel with what is called Chara'at, and they were confined in quarantine rooms. They were sent outside the camp, and it appears to have been punishment in that sense. But chapter 13 doesn't indicate that the real reason that for isolating the person is as a punishment. There is no indication that this is punishment or that the isolation is for a medical reason, though it does have the incidental effect, as I said, of quarantining a contagious disease. I think it is more helpful to look at Numbers 5, chapter 5, verses 2 to 3, for the stated reason, the reason that God gives when he sends somebody outside the camp. And there it is explained that this is because of the impurity. And whether the impurity comes from touching a dead corpse, Numbers 5 says, or from a skin disease, that person cannot dwell in the camp together with God until he is clean again. So the reason is ritual impurity. And I've said repeatedly in previous lessons that the verses here in Leviticus do not refer to clean as opposed to dirty or even to moral faults, sin, because fabrics and houses need purification even though they cannot sin. And so there is, of course, the possibility that diseased persons may be punished by God through disease, but there is not the emphasis here. Disease, in any case, is a general result of a fallen world, and not necessarily because of sin. And we know this clearly from the mouth of Jesus himself in John chapter 9, verses 1 to 3. He was asked if the man was blind because of his own sin or the sin of his father and mother. And Jesus says, no, this is not a disease from sin. All diseases are punishment from God. So when we look at the whole chapter, then this is the segmentation, the division. Verses 2 to 17 deal with the general diagnosis, how the priest should be looking, what the priest should be looking for. Verses 18 to 44 deal with specific cases of boils, burns, itches, baldness, infectious, and otherwise. And verses 45 to 46 describe how impurity or unclean persons should behave. They should be outside the camp, and they should let the hair be untidy and wear, clothes covering up their face and so on. So verses 47 to 59 then deal with another area, impure fabrics, garments, and leather products. So we know that chapters 13 and 14 are connected because the summary in Leviticus 14:54 to 57 summarizes both 13 and 14. Chapter 13 deals with how a priest may diagnose or identify impure situations, and 14, how he cleanses them. And the three sections are marked by the words, the Lord spoke to Moses, Leviticus 13, Leviticus 14, verse 1, and verse 33. And each section does the same thing. It begins with the statement of the symptoms, followed by the priestly inspection, followed by the decision whether it's clean or unclean, occasionally quarantine for further observation 1 week, and then maybe another week. And verse 45, tearing the clothes, having unkempt or untidy hair, covering the mouth, these are all to be done by the unclean person who is chronically unclean. And these are all actions of mourning in Israel, and perhaps even actions of shame. And from this, of course, naturally, the rabbis concluded that lepers were sinners and they were being punished by God. Being outside the camp is a punishment in a way because it is being in a place furthest away from God. Because God dwells in the tabernacle and only holy people can be inside the tabernacle. And most of the time, the holiest person is the priest, and he's not holy by his own right. He's holy because of special cleansing, purification ceremonies too. And just as we ourselves, we are not clean in ourselves, of ourselves, we are clean because of Jesus Christ and his cleansing blood on the cross. Now, being outside is therefore being cut from the covenant of God, and God's blessings are taken away, and it is punishment. Being outside for a strongly communal society like the Jews were and are even today, being outside the camp, being outside the rest of society is a living death. There is no more hope. There is no more God. And for these reasons, mourning is definitely appropriate. And they will long for the day when they will be healed and be reconnected and reunited with their family, with their friends, and with society. And that's why, when we read about Jesus healing the lepers, it was a phenomenal event. Nobody would touch them but Jesus, and they had long been deprived of contact with human society. And we should look at this as a story about a parable about sin, because sin isolates us from God, and we should mourn too for ourselves. So the application, that we learn for our modern day situation. We don't need to worry about the disease anymore because we have good doctors, good medical science, most of us. The lesson spiritually is that God is holy. The whole of Leviticus mentions that. Those who want to dwell in his presence must remain holy. And impurity, even if it is not willful, we didn't deliberately do it, but we may have sinned, as the Anglican liturgy says, we have sinned unintentionally by omission rather than by commission. We have omitted to do something we should have done. Impurity will keep us distant from God and his blessings. The leper was an outcast without hope and without God. Sin similarly drives us from the presence of God without hope. And if not for God's initiative in sending his son, Jesus, to come for us, to find us and to save us, we would be hopelessly condemned. So John 3:16 is therefore that wonderful verse practically every Christian has memorized. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Sin is contagious, and if not removed with drastic measures, sometimes it has to be removed drastically. Jesus metaphorically said, if your hand sins, chop it off. If your eye sins, dig it out, because drastic measures are needed to get rid of sin sometimes. And like the priests, we must regularly inspect our lives and remove the sins that we may come into the presence of God. As 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins. Finally, a note on those diagnosed with terrible diseases. For the very longest time, Hansen's disease, it looks horrible. People with warts on the faces, all kinds of protrusions, they look ugly. And sometimes because they have lost their nervous system, they don't feel pain. The extremities, the fingers, the toes drop off. And sometimes they get burnt up because they can touch fire and not feel pain. So they looked horrible. And in Israel, they were, supposed to look untidy, so people will stay away from them too. So for the longest time possible, perhaps due to poor translations, the hideousness of diseased persons have caused them to be isolated by society. And lepers have long been ostracized and marginalized. And those who work with them are few, and they themselves can capitulate to the disease eventually. And so we tend to isolate people with dreaded disease today. Hansen's disease can now be cured, but there are other diseases that may be incurable, and some cancers are incurable. And perhaps we shun people with dreaded disease like AIDS and so on, HIV. Now, there is no sin that's particularly hideous, and these people may have AIDS not because of moral fault. They could have been infected by blood donations, whatever it is that happen. Babies do get diseases passed on by the mothers. And so we mustn't be looking at all such diseased persons as being punished by God. We are all sinners. We all deserve punishment. And we are all sinners in the image of God. There must be dignity in treating even the diseased person and not to marginalize him or her. Because there is nothing more hideous than sin, and we should be looking at that as repulsive rather than the person. And so we isolate the ones who need to be loved the most when we do that, even if it's just a sin, even if this person really did sin. Jesus loved the sinner, and we are to love the sinner into the kingdom of God. Isolating them and excluding them from our worship and church, that's not right. Questions?